In the shadowed halls of Hillcrest Manor, a murder shatters the silence. Lord Harold Conway lies dead, a letter opener in his heart, and only 4 souls could have done it. The elegant Lady Beatrice, guarding her legacy, reckless Charles drowning in debts, the silent butler Grayson, hiding a past, and Elsa, the German maid whose secrets whisper of espionage. Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet knitting, unravels a web of clues. A hidden staircase, a cryptic German note, a trace of lavender. As war's paranoia tightens its grip, one question burns. Who struck the fatal blow to protect their truth? The 4 Suspects, where every secret is a suspect. Chapter 1. The House on the Hill. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the winding lane that led to Hillcrest, a Georgian manor perched like a sentinel atop a gentle hill. Its ivy-draped walls and tall chimneys spoke of old wealth, but to Miss Jane Marple, stepping from the village taxi with her modest suitcase, the house seemed to pulse with an unspoken disquiet. She adjusted her hat, a sensible affair with a single feather, and gazed at the manor's mullioned windows, which glinted like watchful eyes. Her old friend, Lady Beatrice Conway, had summoned her with a letter both urgent and vague, hinting at a calamity. Miss Marple, never one to ignore a friend's distress, had come at once. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing Beatrice herself, her silver hair impeccably coiled, her black silk dress a shade too formal for an afternoon at home. "Jane, thank heaven you're here," she said, her voice low, her grip on Miss Marple's arm betraying a tremor. "It's Harold, my brother. He's dead. Murdered." The word hung in the air, sharp and final. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, met Beatrice's. "My dear," she said softly, "tell me everything." They settled in the drawing-room, a cavernous space of faded chintz and ancestral portraits. A fire crackled, doing little to warm the chill of grief. Beatrice explained. Lord Harold Conway, Master of Hillcrest, had been found at dawn in his study, a letter-opener plunged into his chest. The village constable, a nervous young man named Hodges, had cordoned off the room and sent for Scotland Yard. But Beatrice had no faith in Hodges' plodding methods. "You see things, Jane," she said, "things others miss. I need you to help us." Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the faint clink of Beatrice's cup against its saucer. "Who was in the house last night?" she asked. Beatrice listed the household, herself, her nephew Charles Conway, a wayward artist in his 30s, Mr. Grayson, the butler, a fixture for 2 decades, and Fräulein Elsa Schmidt, a German maid hired 6 months prior. "Only 4, Miss Marple murmured, her mind already turning. "And no guests, no strangers?" Beatrice shook her head. "The doors were locked, the windows latched. It was one of us, Jane. I feel it." The drawing-room door swung open, and Charles Conway slouched in, his tweed jacket rumpled, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His dark hair fell over a forehead creased with irritation. "Aunt Beatrice, must we have strangers poking about?" he said, casting a glance at Miss Marple, who smiled serenely. "Miss Marple is no stranger, Charles," Beatrice replied sharply. "She's here to help." Charles snorted, exhaling smoke. "Help? Hodges is bad enough, trampling the place. Like a lost sheep, Miss Marple observed his restless hands, the faint redness in his eyes. A man on edge, she thought, and not merely from grief. Mr. Grayson entered next, bearing a tray of sandwiches. His movements were precise, his face a mask of professional calm, though Miss Marple caught a flicker of strain in his tight lips. "Luncheon, my lady," he said, setting the tray down. His dark suit was immaculate, but a single thread hung loose at his cuff, a detail Miss Marple filed away. "Thank you, Grayson," Beatrice said, dismissing him. As he left, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on his retreating figure, wondering what lay beneath his polished surface. The final member of the household, Elsa Schmidt, appeared briefly to clear the tea things. She was young, perhaps 25, with pale blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, and eyes that avoided contact. Her apron was spotless, her movements efficient, yet there was a wariness about her, like a deer poised to flee. "Fräulein Schmidt," Miss Marple said kindly, "how long have you been at Hillcrest?" Elsa's hands paused on the tray. 6 months, ma'am," she replied, her German accent soft but distinct. She curtsied and hurried out, leaving a faint scent of lavender in her wake. Beatrice leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "Harold was difficult, Jane. He quarrelled with everyone. Charles resented his control over the family purse. Grayson, well, Harold threatened to sack him last week. And Elsa, she's so quiet, but Harold mistrusted her, said she was too curious for a maid." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking in her lap. "And you, Beatrice?" she asked gently. Beatrice stiffened. "He was my brother. I loved him despite his temper." Her eyes darted to the fire, and Miss Marple sensed a truth held back, a thread to be tugged later. As evening fell, Miss Marple stood at her guest-room window, gazing at Hillcrest's shadowed lawns. 4 suspects, each with a motive, each with access to the study. A locked house, a single weapon, a dead man. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small betrayals, a stolen letter, a whispered rumour, revealed human nature's darker corners. Hillcrest was no different, only grander. Somewhere in this house, she knew, lay a clue as small and sharp as the letter opener itself. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple turned from the window, ready to unravel the secrets of the house on the hill. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The morning mist clung to Hillcrest's lawns as Miss Jane Marple descended the grand staircase, her black shawl draped over her shoulders. The house was silent, save for the distant ticking of a grandfather clock, its rhythm a stark reminder of time's indifference to tragedy. Lady Beatrice had arranged for Miss Marple to inspect Lord Harold Conway's study before Scotland Yard's arrival, and Constable Hodges, flustered but deferential, awaited her at the study door. "It's a grim business, ma'am," he muttered, fumbling with his notebook. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile, her keen eyes already scanning the corridor's polished floorboards for any trace of disturbance. The study door, heavy oak with a brass handle, stood ajar. Miss Marple stepped inside, her senses alert to the room's sombre atmosphere. The air was thick with the must of old books and the faint metallic tang of blood. Sunlight filtered through heavy velvet curtains, illuminating a large desk of dark mahogany, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a crystal decanter half filled with amber liquid. The Persian rug beneath bore a dark stain, now congealing, where Harold's body had lain. Hodges pointed to the spot, his voice low. "Found him there, ma'am, face down, letter opener right through his heart." Miss Marple's gaze settled on the letter opener, now resting on the desk, its silver blade gleaming despite the horror it had wrought. It was an antique, its handle intricately carved with vines, sharp enough to suggest intent rather than impulse. "Wiped clean, I presume?" she asked. Hodges nodded, his cheeks reddening. "Not a smudge, ma'am. Whoever did it knew to cover their tracks." She nodded, her mind noting the absence of fingerprints as a clue in itself. Careful, calculated, deliberate. She moved to the desk, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of a half-written letter, the ink still fresh. It was addressed to Harold's solicitor, the words halting and abrupt. "My will must be altered. Charles cannot be trusted, and I suspect—" The sentence ended in a blot, as if the pen had been snatched away. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A change of will, a hint of suspicion. Here was motive, raw and undeniable. She tucked the detail away, her thoughts darting to Charles's restless demeanour and Beatrice's guarded silences. The room itself told a story. A single door led to the corridor, its lock unforced, suggesting the killer had entered openly or with Harold's consent. A narrow staircase, hidden behind a bookcase, spiralled to the upper floors, its steps dusty but not untouched. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The staircase offered a discreet path, perhaps known to the household. She knelt by the rug, her knees protesting, and noticed a faint thread, blue, silken, caught in the weave, alien to the rug's crimson and gold. She slipped it into her handkerchief, her expression unchanged. A faint scent lingered, not the blood or the decanter's brandy, but something softer, lavender, delicate yet distinct. It recalled the maid, Elsa Schmidt, and her fleeting presence the previous day. Miss Marple rose, her gaze sweeping the bookshelves, where volumes on military, history and cryptography stood alongside dusty ledgers. Harold, Beatrice had said, was a man of fierce intellect, his temper matched only by his curiosity. Had he stumbled upon something dangerous, something worth killing for? Hodges shuffled, eager to speak. "The family's in a state, ma'am. Lady Beatrice says Lord Harold quarrelled with young Charles last week over money. Mr. Grayson, the butler, was heard shouting at his lordship 2 nights ago. Something about wages owed, and that German maid." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Folks in the village don't trust her. War's made everyone jumpy." Miss Marple listened, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. Village gossip, she knew, was often a distorted mirror, but even distortions held grains of truth. She approached the window, its latch secure, the glass unmarred, no sign of forced entry, no muddy footprints on the sill. The killer had been inside Hillcrest, one of the 4 souls now cloaked in suspicion. She turned to Hodges, her voice gentle but firm. "Constable, ensure no one disturbs this room until Scotland Yard arrives, and tell me, was anything taken? A watch, perhaps, or papers?" Hodges blinked, surprised. "Not that we've noticed, ma'am, but I'll check again." As they left the study, Miss Marple paused in the corridor, her eyes lingering on a portrait of Harold, his stern face framed by mutton chops, his gaze piercing even in oil. A man who saw too much, she thought, and perhaps said too much. The lavender scent, the blue thread, the unfinished letter. They were fragments, small as the stitches in her knitting, yet each held the promise of a pattern. She tightened her shawl and moved toward the drawing-room where the household awaited, their secrets as tightly locked as the study door. Chapter 3. The Lady of the House. The late morning light filtered through the tall windows of Hillcrest's drawing-room, casting a soft glow on the faded damask wallpaper and the polished surfaces of the mahogany furniture. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, a pale blue shawl draped over her shoulders. The room, with its heavy drapes and ancestral portraits, exuded an air of genteel decay, as if the weight of the Conway family's history pressed against its walls. Lady Beatrice Conway, seated across from her on a velvet settee, poured tea from a silver pot, her movements graceful but deliberate, like a dancer performing a well-rehearsed role. The faint clink of porcelain was the only sound, save for the distant chime of the hall clock marking the hour. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes, sharp beneath their deceptive softness, studied her old friend, noting the faint lines of strain around Beatrice's mouth and the way her fingers lingered on the teapot's handle, as if seeking reassurance in its solidity. "Thank you, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup, her voice gentle but with an undertone that invited confidence. "This is a trying time, and I'm grateful for your hospitality." She sipped the tea, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of the tragedy that hung over Hillcrest. Lord Harold Conway's murder, discovered only the previous morning, had cast a shadow over the household, and Beatrice, as its mistress, bore the brunt of its weight. Miss Marple had known Beatrice since their school days, when she was Beatrice Langley, a spirited girl with a knack for managing others. Now, as Lady Conway, widowed and childless, she ruled Hillcrest with a quiet authority. But Miss Marple sensed a crack in that composure, a fissure widened by her brother's death. Beatrice set down the teapot, her black morning dress rustling softly. "It's I who should be grateful, Jane," she said, her voice low, carrying the polished cadence of the upper class. "Scotland Yard will come, of course, but they're strangers. You understand people, our sort of people." Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, and Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words. "Our sort of people." It was a phrase that spoke of shared values, of a world bound by tradition, yet it also hinted at secrets kept within those boundaries. "I only hope," Beatrice continued, "that you can help us find the truth before this horror tears us apart." Miss Marple inclined her head, her knitting needles pausing briefly. "I shall do my best, my dear. But the truth, as you know, often lies in the small things, the things we overlook." She resumed knitting, the soft click of the needles a counterpoint to her words. "Tell me about Harold. What sort of man was he these past months?" The question was simple, but Miss Marple's tone carried a weight that demanded candour. She had already formed an impression of Harold from the study's grim scene. The blood-stained rug, the half-written letter, the air of a man interrupted. But Beatrice, as his sister and confidant, held pieces of the puzzle no one else could provide. Beatrice's hands folded in her lap, her sapphire ring catching the light. "Harold was difficult," she began, choosing her words with care. He always had a temper, even as a boy, but lately it had grown sharper. He was consumed by the estate, by its finances, its legacy. He felt the weight of being the last Conway, you see. Her voice softened, a flicker of affection breaking through her reserve. He was 10 years my senior, and after my husband died, Harold took it upon himself to protect me, to ensure Hillcrest remained ours. But he could be so unyielding. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting but her mind alert. Unyielding in what way? She prompted, sensing Beatrice's hesitation. The drawing-room, with its heavy silence, seemed to press in, urging confession. Beatrice sighed, a sound barely audible. He quarrelled with everyone. With Charles, of course, our nephew. Charles is reckless, Jane. He paints, calls himself an artist, but he's run up debts Harold refused to cover. Last week, Harold told him he'd be cut from the will. Left, with nothing but a pittance. Charles was furious, shouting that Harold was a tyrant. Her voice tightened, and Miss Marple noted the way Beatrice's fingers clenched, the knuckles whitening. I tried to mediate, to reason with Harold, but he wouldn't listen. He said Charles needed to learn responsibility, or the estate would be ruined. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Charles's anger, his financial desperation, was a thread she had already begun to tug, but Beatrice's account added depth. A disinherited nephew, volatile and resentful, had clear motive, yet Beatrice's role as mediator intrigued her. You must have been in a delicate position, Miss Marple said gently, trying to keep peace between them. Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin line. I did what I could. Hillcrest is my home, Jane. I've managed its accounts since my husband's death, and Harold relied on me. But he was planning to change his will, to leave the estate to a distant cousin in Canada, a man we've never met. He said it was to protect the Conway name, but She paused, her eyes flickering to the fire, its flames casting shadows across her face. I thought it cruel to cast Charles aside so completely. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her expression remained serene. Beatrice's words carried a hint of indignation, perhaps resentment. Hillcrest was her domain, its daily workings under her control. A new heir, an outsider, would shift that balance, perhaps diminish her authority. Did you tell Harold how you felt? Miss Marple asked, her tone as soft as the wool in her hands. I begged him to reconsider, Beatrice admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. We argued the night before it happened. Not loudly, you understand, but firmly. I told him Charles deserved a chance, that the estate was our family's heart, not some stranger's inheritance. He accused me of being sentimental, of undermining his judgment. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them tighter. I left him in the study, Jane. That was the last time I saw him alive. Miss Marple's heart stirred with sympathy, but her mind remained clear. Beatrice's argument with Harold, however restrained, placed her in the study close to the time of the murder. The half-written letter to the solicitor, hinting at a change in the will, suggested Harold had been mulling over his decision. Had Beatrice's pleas swayed him, or had they pushed him further toward his fatal resolve? It must have been painful, Miss Marple said, her voice warm but probing, to feel your brother slipping away from you, in judgment and in life. Beatrice's eyes met hers, and for a moment a raw vulnerability surfaced. "It was," she said simply. "But I loved him, Jane. Despite his faults, he was my brother." The words were sincere, yet Miss Marple, with her knack for hearing what was unsaid, sensed a complexity beneath them. Love, she knew, could coexist with anger, with ambition, even with desperation. The conversation shifted, guided by Miss Marple's subtle questions, to the other members of the household. "Tell me about Mr. Grayson," she said, her needles pausing as she reached for a biscuit. "A butler of 20 years must be a pillar of the house." Beatrice's composure returned, her voice steadying. "Grayson is impeccable, Jane. Discreet, efficient, the sort of man who anticipates your needs before you voice them. But Harold was harsh with him lately. Grayson asked for a raise. His sister, I believe, is ill and needs care. Harold refused, called him ungrateful. I overheard them in the hall 2 nights ago. Grayson's voice raised, which is unheard of. He said something about loyalty, deserving better." She frowned, as if the memory troubled her. "Grayson apologized to me later, but I could see he was shaken." Miss Marple filed away the detail, picturing Grayson's polished exterior and the loose thread on his cuff. A man of pride, wounded by insult, might act in ways his demeanour concealed. "And the maid, Fräulein Schmidt?" she asked, her tone light, as if the question were an afterthought. Beatrice's expression darkened, her lips pursing. "Elsa is competent. She keeps to herself, does her work well. But there's something about her, Jane. She's too watchful, always lingering near doorways, as if listening. Harold didn't trust her. He said she asked too many questions about the estate, about his papers. With the war, and her being German." Beatrice trailed off, her fingers brushing the sapphire ring. "I don't wish to be uncharitable, but I wonder about her." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning to Elsa's wary eyes and the lavender scent in the study. Beatrice's suspicion, tinged with wartime prejudice, was not uncommon, but it carried weight. A maid with forged references, as Miss Marple would later learn, had much to hide. "You've had a great deal to manage," she said, her voice soothing. "Hillcrest, Harold, the family. It's a heavy burden." Beatrice's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the acknowledgment unlocked a hidden weariness. "It is," she admitted, "but I've always done my duty, Jane. For the family, for Hillcrest." Her eyes drifted to a portrait above the fireplace, a stern-faced man in Victorian attire, a Conway ancestor. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the resemblance to Harold in the set of the jaw, the unyielding stare. Duty, she thought, could be a noble motive, or a dangerous one. The door opened and Elsa Schmidt entered, her apron crisp, her blonde hair pinned tightly. She carried a tray to clear the tea things, her movements silent but precise. "Excuse me, my lady," she murmured, her German accent soft but unmistakable. Beatrice nodded curtly, and Miss Marple watched Elsa's hands, steady, unhurried, yet with a tension in the knuckles. The faint scent of lavender followed her, confirming Miss Marple's earlier observation. As Elsa left, Beatrice's eyes narrowed, a flicker of distrust passing across her face. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her mind weaving the threads of the morning's conversation. Beatrice's love for her brother was genuine, but so was her attachment to Hillcrest, its power and prestige. Her argument with Harold, her role as the estate steward, placed her at the heart of the mystery. Charles's debts, Grayson's wounded pride, Elsa's secretive air, each was a strand, but Beatrice's position tied them together. Had she acted to protect her world, or was she merely a witness to its unravelling? Rising, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt. "I think I'll take a turn in the garden, Beatrice," she said, her smile disarming. "The air will do me good." Beatrice nodded, her composure restored, but Miss Marple felt the weight of her gaze as she left the room. Outside, the autumn, leaves crunched underfoot, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the study. The letter opener, the blue thread, the unfinished letter. Beatrice had given her much, but not all. The truth, as always, lay in the gaps, in the silences between words. With a quiet resolve, she walked on, her mind as sharp as the needles in her bag, ready to stitch together the secrets of Hillcrest. Chapter 4. The Prodigal Nephew. The autumn afternoon draped Hillcrest in a golden haze, the sun slanting through the bare branches of the elms that lined the manor's gardens. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl drawn close against the crisp air, walked the gravel path toward the rose garden, where she had been told Charles Conway often retreated to sketch. Her sensible shoes crunched softly, the sound a quiet counterpoint to the whirl of her thoughts. The morning's discoveries, the blood-stained study, the half-written letter, Beatrice's guarded confidences, had sharpened her focus on the household's 4 suspects. Charles, the spendthrift nephew, was next, his volatile nature and financial woes marking him as a figure of interest. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes, deceptive in their gentleness, scanned the garden, alert for the man whose charm, she suspected, masked a deeper unrest. The rose garden, though past its summer glory, retained a faded elegance, its thorny bushes pruned with care, their last blooms clinging defiantly to life. At its centre stood a weathered stone bench, where Charles Conway lounged, a sketchbook open on his lap, a cigarette smouldering between his fingers. His tweed jacket, stained with paint and ash, hung loosely on his lean frame, and his dark hair fell in a careless wave over a forehead creased with irritation. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his green eyes narrowing, then softening into a practised smile. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, his voice smooth but tinged with mockery. "Aunt Beatrice's sleuth, come to poke about in our dirty laundry?" Miss Marple returned his smile, her expression serene, as if his barb were a mere breeze. "Hardly that, Mr. Conway," she replied, settling onto the bench with a grace that belied her years. "I'm only here to help, if I can. The garden is lovely, even in autumn. Do you often sketch here?" Her tone was light, her knitting bag resting on her lap, but her question carried a purpose, inviting him to lower his guard. Charles exhaled a plume of smoke, his gaze flicking to the sketchbook, where a half-finished drawing of a rose lay, its lines bold but unsteady. "When the mood strikes," he said, shrugging. "Uncle Harold called it a waste of time, but it's better than his endless ledgers." His voice held a bitter edge, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on the pencil, the knuckles whitening. She had seen such restlessness before, in young men of St. Mary Mead who chafed against restraint, their tempers a spark waiting for tinder. "I understand you and your uncle were not always in agreement," she said gently, her needles emerging. From her bag, their soft clicking a soothing rhythm. It must have been difficult, living under his expectations. The statement was simple, but her eyes, fixed on her knitting, missed nothing. The flicker of resentment in Charles's face, the slight twitch of his mouth. Difficult? Charles laughed, a sharp, humourless sound. "That's putting it mildly, Miss Marple." Uncle Harold was a tyrant, squeezing every penny, doling out my allowance like I was a schoolboy. He wanted me to be him, sitting in that stuffy study counting coins. I'm an artist, not a clerk. He flicked his cigarette into the gravel, grinding it under his heel. He threatened to cut me off, you know. Said I'd get nothing if I didn't shape up, as if I'd grovel for his scraps. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze lifting to meet his. "That must have been terribly upsetting," she said, her voice warm with sympathy but laced with a quiet probe. "To feel your future so uncertain." She had read the half-written letter in Harold's study, its hint of disinheriting Charles, a clear motive. But she wanted his story, unfiltered, to see where his words led. Charles leaned back, his hands raking through his hair, leaving it more dishevelled. Upsetting. It was infuriating. I told him what I thought of his precious estate, his precious Conway name. We had it out last week, right there in his study. He called me a leech, a disgrace. I said he was a miser who'd rather see the family rot than let me live. His voice rose, then caught, as if he realized he'd said too much. He forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not that I'd kill him, mind you. I'm no murderer, whatever Aunt Beatrice thinks." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, though her mind catalogued his words. His anger was raw, his pride wounded, but his quick denial intrigued her. In St. Mary Mead, she had known men who protested their innocence too swiftly, their bravado a shield for guilt. "Of course," she said soothingly, "but it helps to understand the household, you see. Where were you the night your uncle died?" The question was gentle, almost casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching for his reaction. Charles hesitated, his fingers drumming on the sketchbook. "In the village," he said at last, "at the Red Lion, having a drink. I needed to clear my head after another row with Harold. Got back late, midnight maybe. He was still alive then, shouting at Grayson in the hall. I went to bed and next thing I know, Aunt Beatrice is screaming about murder." His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease, a slight shift in his posture. "The Red Lion," she mused, her needles clicking again. "A lively place, I'm sure. Were you with friends?" She knew the pub's patrons would be questioned by Scotland Yard, but she wanted Charles's account to test its seams for weaknesses. "Some locals," he said vaguely, his eyes darting to the rose bushes. "Can't recall their names. You know how it is, bit of a blur after a few pints." He laughed, but it sounded forced, and Miss Marple's mind noted the vagueness, the lack of specifics. An alibi so porous was no alibi at all. She thought of the study's single door, the hidden staircase, and Charles's room on the upper floor, close enough for a late-night descent. Her gaze fell to his wrist, where a fresh scratch, red and jagged, peeked from beneath his cuff. "That looks painful," she said, her voice all concern. "A gardening mishap, perhaps?" The question was innocent, but her mind flashed to the letter opener's sharp blade, the possibility of a struggle. Charles tugged his sleeve down, his smile tight. "Painting accident," he muttered. "Caught my arm on a canvas stretcher. Clumsy of me." He stood abruptly, tossing the sketchbook onto the bench. "Look, Miss Marple, I don't mean to be rude, but I've had enough of questions. I didn't kill him, and that's that." He lit another cigarette, his hands unsteady, and strode toward the garden gate, leaving a trail of smoke in his wake. Miss Marple watched him go, her needles still, her thoughts racing. Charles's temper, his shaky alibi, the scratch on his wrist. They were pieces of a puzzle, each sharp-edged and suggestive. She rose, retrieving the sketchbook he'd left behind. The rose drawing was incomplete, its lines frantic, as if drawn in a fury. Tucked between the pages was a crumpled note, its ink smudged but legible. "Meet me at the Lion, 10 p.m. We'll settle it." No signature, no date, but the paper was fresh, its creases new. She slipped it into her handkerchief, her heart quickening. A clue, small but significant, like a dropped stitch in a perfect row. She walked back toward the house, the gravel crunching underfoot, her mind turning to the other suspects. Beatrice's control, Grayson's wounded pride, Elsa's secretive air. Each had their motives, their opportunities. But Charles's volatility stood out, a bright thread in the tapestry of Hillcrest's secrets. She thought of the blue thread in the study's rug, the lavender scent, the letter's abrupt end. Charles had been in the house, his room near the hidden staircase, his anger a spark that could have ignited into violence. Yet his denial, his quick retreat, suggested fear as much as guilt. Was he hiding a crime, or something else? As she neared the manor, she paused by a window, catching a glimpse of Charles inside, pacing the library, a glass of brandy in his hand. His face, unguarded, was drawn, his eyes haunted. Miss Marple's heart stirred with pity, but her mind remained clear. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen young men like Charles, charming, reckless, trapped by their own desires. Some were redeemed, others ruined. Which was he? The note, the scratch, the pub's vague witnesses. They were leads to follow, threads to weave. With a quiet resolve, she entered the house, her knitting bag swinging gently, ready to unravel the next layer of Hillcrest's dark design. Chapter 5. The Silent Butler. The late afternoon light bathed Hillcrest in a soft amber glow, the long shadows of the elms stretching across the manor's lawns like fingers reaching for secrets. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl neatly folded over her arm, made her way through the house's labyrinthine corridors, her sensible shoes whispering against the polished oak floorboards. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax and old wood, a reminder of Hillcrest's enduring grandeur. Yet beneath it lingered a tension, sharp and unspoken, that seemed to seep from the very walls. Her morning had been spent unravelling threads of motive. Beatrice's guarded authority, Charles's volatile resentment, and now her attention turned to Mr. Grayson, the butler, whose polished exterior, she suspected, concealed a deeper story. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes, deceptively gentle, scanned the doorways as she approached the pantry, where Grayson was said to spend his afternoons tending to the household silver. The pantry was a narrow, orderly room, its shelves lined, with gleaming cutlery and crystal decanters, each item arranged with military precision. Grayson stood at a long table, a cloth in one hand, a silver candlestick in the other, his movements slow and deliberate, as if polishing were a ritual to steady the soul. He was a man of middle years, his dark hair streaked with grey, his face etched with lines that spoke of duty borne quietly. His black suit was immaculate, save for the faint ink stain on his cuff, a detail Miss Marple had noted the previous day, and now observed again, her mind filing it alongside the other fragments of the case. The lavender scent, the blue thread, the cryptic note from Charles's sketchbook. "Good afternoon, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and unassuming as she stepped into the room, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work. The silver is quite splendid. Such care must take a steady hand." Grayson paused, his cloth stilling on the candlestick, and turned to her, his expression a mask of professional courtesy. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice low and measured, with the faint trace of a London accent smoothed by years of service. "No interruption at all, ma'am. It's kind of you to say so." He set the candlestick down, aligning it precisely with its fellows, and faced her fully, his dark eyes steady but guarded, like a man accustomed to keeping his thoughts locked away. Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a wooden stool near the table, her movements deliberate, as if she were merely a curious guest. "I've always admired the work of a good butler," she said, her needles emerging from her bag, their soft clicking a soothing counterpoint to her words. "It's a role that sees so much, isn't it? The heart of a household, all its comings and goings." Her tone was light, but her words carried a subtle invitation, urging him to share what those keen eyes of his had seen. Grayson's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "One does observe, ma'am," he said, picking up a silver spoon and resuming his polishing. "But discretion is part of the job. I tend to the house, not its secrets." His voice was polite, but Miss Marple caught the faint edge beneath it, a hint of wariness that suggested he knew more than he wished to say. She thought of Beatrice's account of Grayson's argument with Harold, the rare crack in his composure, and wondered what had provoked it. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking steadily. "Discretion is a virtue, especially in a house like Hillcrest. But such a tragedy, Lord Conway's death, must test even the steadiest resolve. I understand you were close to the family, having served here so long." She paused, her eyes lifting to meet his, her gaze gentle but probing, like sunlight piercing a curtain's gap. Grayson's hand stilled briefly, the spoon glinting in his grasp. 20 years, ma'am," he said, his voice quieter now. "I came to Hillcrest when Lady Beatrice was newly widowed, and Lord Conway was still a vigorous man. It's been my life's work to keep the house running smoothly." He resumed polishing, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers pressed harder against the cloth. "His lordship's death is a great loss," he added, the words formal, yet carrying a weight that suggested personal grief. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said, her voice all sympathy, "to lose someone you've served so faithfully. I heard there was some disagreement between you and Lord Conway recently. A matter of wages, perhaps." The question was gentle, almost incidental, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the flicker of reaction she knew would come. Grayson's hands paused, the spoon suspended above the table, and for a moment his mask slipped, revealing a flash of something. Anger, perhaps, or shame. "You've been speaking to Lady Beatrice," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of strain. "Yes, there was a discussion. I asked for an increase in my wages. My sister, you see, is unwell, and the doctor's bills are considerable. His lordship did not see fit to grant it. He felt I'd been adequately compensated for my service." His voice was steady, but the words carried a bitterness, faint but unmistakable. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "That must have been disheartening," she said, her tone warm with understanding, "to feel your loyalty questioned after so many years." She thought of the ink stain on his cuff, the hidden staircase in the study, and wondered if Grayson's wounded pride had driven him to more than words. In St. Mary Mead she had known men who bore slights quietly, their resentment simmering until it boiled over in unexpected ways. Grayson set the spoon down, aligning it with precision, and met her gaze, his eyes steady once more. "It was a momentary lapse, ma'am," he said. "I spoke out of turn, and his lordship was within his rights to refuse. I returned to my duties, as always. That was 2 nights before the tragedy." He hesitated, then added, "I was in my room that evening, after seeing to the household. I heard nothing until Mr. Charles's shouts woke the house at dawn." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind cataloguing his words. His alibi was simple, unverifiable, much like Charles's vague tale of the pub. The butler's room, she knew, was on the upper floor, near the hidden staircase that led to the study, a convenient path for a man moving in the night. "You must have been shocked," she said, her voice gentle, "to hear such news after so quiet an evening." "Shocked, yes," Grayson said, his tone formal again. "But a butler's role is to maintain order, even in chaos. I assisted. Constable Hodges ensured the staff remained calm." He picked up another candlestick, his movements precise. But Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor in his fingers, a crack in his impeccable control. She shifted her approach, her voice taking on a conversational lilt. "The household seems well run, Mr. Grayson. The maid, Fräulein Schmidt, for instance. She's quite efficient, isn't she? Though new to Hillcrest, I understand." The question was casual, but Miss Marple's eyes were alert, watching for any sign of collusion or distrust between the servants. Grayson's cloth slowed, his expression tightening. "Fräulein Schmidt is competent," he said, his voice clipped. "She performs her duties well, though she keeps to herself. His lordship found her overly curious at times, but I've had no cause to complain." His words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the hesitation, the slight emphasis on curious. She thought of Elsa's lavender scent, her wary eyes, and the village whispers of German spies. Grayson's reserve suggested he knew more than he was saying, perhaps about Elsa, perhaps about the night of the murder. "You've a keen eye, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You must notice things others miss, the small details that keep a house like this running." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a confiding tone. "Did you notice anything unusual that night? A sound, perhaps, or someone out of place?" The question was gentle, but her gaze was steady, probing for the truth hidden beneath his polished surface. Grayson's hand stilled, the candlestick gleaming in the light. For a moment he was silent, his eyes fixed on the silver, as if weighing his words. "Nothing specific, ma'am," he said at last. "The house was quiet after dinner. I locked the doors, as always, and retired. If there was anything amiss, I didn't hear it." His voice was calm, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his lips, the way his fingers brushed the ink-stained cuff, as if to conceal it. She nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm, her mind racing. Grayson's composure was formidable, but not impenetrable. The ink stain, the argument with Harold, his proximity to the study's staircase. They were threads in a pattern, each suggestive of possibility. She thought of the study's single door, the wiped-clean letter-opener, the blue thread in the rug. Grayson's role as butler gave him access, opportunity, and a knowledge of Hillcrest's rhythms that could conceal a crime. Yet his restraint, his careful answers, suggested a man guarding something. Guilt, fear, or loyalty to another. Rising from the stool, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, her smile as warm as ever. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson," she said. "You've been most helpful. I'll let you return to your work. The silver looks splendid." She moved toward the door, then paused as if struck by a thought. "Oh, one small thing. Did Lord Conway ever mention anything about his papers? He seemed quite absorbed in his study, from what I've heard." Grayson's eyes flickered, a brief shadow crossing his face. "His lordship was private about his work, ma'am," he said. "He kept his papers locked in the desk, though he'd been reading more of late. Books on codes, military matters. I assumed it was a hobby." His tone was even, but Miss Marple noted the quick glance toward the door, as if he wished her gone. She nodded, her heart quickening. Harold's interest in codes, hinted at by Beatrice, now confirmed by Grayson, added a new dimension to the case. Had he uncovered something dangerous, something worth killing for? With a final smile, she left the pantry, the click of her heels echoing in the corridor. Outside, the afternoon was fading, the sky streaked with crimson. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the ink stain, the staircase, Grayson's measured words. In St. Mary Mead she had known men like him, quiet, dutiful, their secrets buried deep. Whether Grayson's silence hid guilt or merely pride, she would find out. For now, she tightened her shawl and walked on, her knitting bag at her side, ready to weave the next thread in Hillcrest's dark tapestry. Chapter 6. The German Maid. The twilight settled over Hillcrest like a velvet curtain, softening the sharp edges of the manor's Georgian facade and casting long, inky shadows across its frost-tipped lawns. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl drawn tightly against the evening chill, moved through the house with the quiet purpose of a woman who knew that truth often hid in the overlooked corners of a day. The past hours had been a tapestry of revelations. Beatrice's controlled grief, Charles's reckless defiance, Grayson's guarded precision, each thread weaving a pattern of motive and opportunity around Lord Harold Conway's murder. Now, her attention turned to the final suspect, Fräulein Elsa Schmidt, the German maid whose aloof demeanour and faint lavender scent had lingered in Miss Marple's mind since their first encounter. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the kitchen stone floor as she approached. Her mild blue eyes, deceptively soft, alert for the woman whose past, she sensed, held a key to the mystery. The kitchen was a warm, cavernous space, its copper pots gleaming in the glow of a single lamp, the air heavy with the scent of fresh bread and herbs. Elsa stood at a scrubbed oak table, her hands deftly peeling apples, the knife moving with a precision that spoke of habit rather than haste. She was young, no more than 25, her pale blonde hair pinned into a severe bun, her grey dress and starched apron immaculate. Her face, pale and angular, held a quiet beauty, but her eyes, ice blue and wary, darted toward Miss Marple as she entered, betraying a tension that no amount of composure could mask. The faint scent of lavender, familiar from the study, clung to her, a subtle clue that Miss Marple tucked away like a dropped stitch in her knitting. "Good evening, Fräulein Schmidt," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and unassuming as she settled onto a wooden chair near the table, her knitting bag resting on her lap. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. The kitchen is so cosy this time of day, quite a change from the rest of the house." Her tone was conversational, her smile disarming, as if she were merely a guest seeking a moment's respite. But her words were chosen with care, designed to ease the maid's guard while inviting her to speak. Elsa's hands paused, the knife hovering above an apple, and she inclined her head slightly, her accent soft but distinct. "Good evening, ma'am," she replied, her voice steady but guarded, like a door bolted from within. "You are not disturbing me. I am only preparing for tomorrow's breakfast." She resumed peeling, her movements precise. But Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes avoided prolonged contact. A woman on edge, she thought, and not without reason. Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft clicking a soothing rhythm in the quiet kitchen. "You've a deft hand," she said, nodding toward the pile of neatly peeled apples. "It's a skill, keeping a house like Hillcrest running smoothly. How long have you been here, you said? 6 months." The question was gentle, a repetition of their earlier exchange, but now laced with a subtle probe, testing Elsa's consistency and composure. "6 months, yes, ma'am," Elsa said, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the apple in her hand. "I came from London, through an agency. Lady Beatrice needed a maid, and I was glad of the work." Her words were rehearsed, delivered with the cadence of someone who had answered the question before. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind noting the lack of warmth, the absence of personal detail. In St. Mary Mead, she had known girls who spoke thus, guarding secrets, their pasts a shadow they could not outrun. "It must be quite a change," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic, coming from a city to a place like Hillcrest. "So grand but so isolated. Do you find it suits you?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft but searching, watching for the flicker of truth beneath Elsa's careful facade. Elsa's knife slowed, a curl of apple peel falling to the table. "It suits me well enough," she said, her voice low. "The work is steady, and Lord Conway was kind." The mention of Harold brought a slight catch to her words, and Miss Marple's heart stirred with curiosity. Kindness was not a trait Beatrice or Charles had ascribed to Harold, yet Elsa's tone held a sincerity that suggested a connection, however fleeting. "Kind," Miss Marple echoed, her needles pausing, her gaze lifting to meet Elsa's. "That's a comfort to hear in such a sad time. Lord Conway's death must have been a shock to you, being so new to the household." Her voice was all concern, but her question was a gentle prod, urging Elsa to reveal what she had seen or heard on the night of the murder. Elsa's hands stilled, the knife resting on the table, and for a moment her composure wavered, her eyes darting to the lamp's flickering flame. "It was a shock, yes," she said, her accent thickening slightly, as if emotion had loosened her control. "I knew nothing of it until morning, when Lady Beatrice called for the constable. I was upstairs, cleaning the hall the evening before. I heard no cries, no footsteps." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, the way her fingers brushed the lavender sachet tucked into her apron pocket. A nervous gesture, unconscious but telling. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Upstairs, you say?" she mused, her tone light. "Near the back staircase, perhaps? It's such a large house, one could move about unnoticed, I imagine." The question was casual, but her mind was sharp, picturing the hidden staircase that led from the upper floors to the study, its dusty steps a path to opportunity. Elsa's room, she had learned from Beatrice, was close to that staircase, a detail that now loomed large. Elsa's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing her face. "The back staircase, yes," she said, her voice tight. "But I was in the hall, ma'am, not near the study. I finished my work and went to my room. I sleep soundly." Her hands resumed peeling. But the knife moved faster now, the apples piling up in uneven slices. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sachet, its lavender scent a silent echo of the study's air, a clue that tied Elsa to the scene of the crime. "You must be very diligent," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "Lady Beatrice speaks highly of your work, though she mentioned Lord Conway found you. Curious, perhaps, asking questions about the estate." The accusation was softened by her tone, but her eyes were steady, watching for the crack in Elsa's armour she knew would come. Elsa's knife slipped, nicking her finger, and a bead of blood welled up, stark against her pale skin. She gasped softly, reaching for a cloth, and Miss Marple noted the sudden flush in her cheeks, the way her eyes darted to the door. "I asked no questions, ma'am," she said, her voice sharp, almost defensive. "I do my work, nothing more. Lord Conway was mistaken." She wrapped the cloth around her finger, her movements jerky, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. The denial was too quick, too vehement, like a door slammed shut to hide what lay within. "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly, her needles clicking softly. "It's easy to misunderstand, especially in a house under strain. The war makes us all cautious, doesn't it? A German accent, even a faint one, draws attention." Her words were gentle, but they carried a weight, touching on the village whispers of spies that Beatrice had echoed. She wanted to see how Elsa would respond, whether fear or defiance would surface. Elsa's eyes met hers, and for a moment a raw intensity burned in their icy depths. "I am no spy," she said, her voice low but fierce. "I left Germany to escape the war, not to bring it here. I am only a maid, ma'am, trying to live quietly." Her accent thickened, her words carrying a conviction that stirred Miss Marple's sympathy, but her mind remained clear. Sincerity, she knew, could be a mask, and Elsa's past, her forged references, as Scotland Yard would later confirm, suggested a life more complex than that of a simple maid. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze softening. "I believe you wish to live quietly," she said, her voice kind. "But Hillcrest is not a quiet place, is it? Not with such a tragedy. Did you notice anything that night, Fräulein Schmidt? A sound, perhaps, or someone moving about?" The question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, searching for the truth hidden in Elsa's careful words. Elsa's hands stilled, the cloth pressed tightly around her finger. "Nothing, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I was upstairs, then in my room. The house was still." Her eyes dropped to the table, and Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her shoulders, the way her fingers clutched the sachet as if it were a talisman. The lavender, the staircase, the forged references, they were pieces of a puzzle, each pointing to Elsa as more than she seemed. Rising from the chair, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, her smile as warm as ever. "Thank you, Fräulein Schmidt," she said. "You've been most kind to speak with me. I'll let you finish your work. The apples look splendid." She moved toward the door, then paused, as if struck by a thought. "Oh, one small thing. Did Lord Conway ever speak of his papers? He seemed quite absorbed in his study from what I've heard." Elsa's head snapped up, her eyes wide for a fleeting moment, before she schooled her expression. "No, ma'am," she said, her voice flat. "He spoke little to me, only of household matters. I know nothing of his papers." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the quick glance toward the sachet, the slight tightening of her lips. A lie, perhaps, or a truth half told. With a final nod, Miss Marple left the kitchen, the echo of her footsteps fading into the house's silence. Outside, the twilight had deepened to dusk, the sky a bruised purple above Hillcrest's chimneys. Miss Marple tightened her shawl, her thoughts racing. Elsa's wariness, her lavender scent, her proximity to the staircase, they were threads in a pattern, each suggestive of guilt or fear. She thought of Harold's books on codes, Grayson's ink-stained cuff, Charles's cryptic note. Elsa's denial of curiosity, her fierce rejection of the spy label, rang true in part, but her past, shrouded in falsehoods, suggested a secret worth protecting. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known women who fled their histories, their lies a shield against a world that judged too harshly. Was Elsa such a woman, or had her desperation turned deadly? As she walked toward the drawing-room, where Beatrice awaited, Miss Marple's mind turned to the study. The wiped-clean letter-opener, the blue thread, the half-written letter. Elsa's role as maid gave her access, her lavender a silent witness to her presence. Whether she was a spy, a fugitive, or merely a girl caught in war's shadow, Miss Marple would find out. For now, she clutched her knitting bag, its weight a comfort, and moved on, ready to unravel the next layer of Hillcrest's dark design. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The morning sun broke through the mist that clung to St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a pale, watery light that did little to warm the chill of autumn. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, and her sensible hat firmly in place, stepped briskly along the cobbled lane toward the heart of the village. Hillcrest, with its shadowed corridors and unspoken tensions, lay behind her, but its secrets followed, woven into the threads of her thoughts. The past days had been a delicate dance of observation. Beatrice's poised control, Charles's reckless defiance, Grayson's guarded precision, Elsa's wary silences, each revealing motives that coiled around Lord Harold Conway's murder, like ivy on the manor's walls. Now Miss Marple sought the village's pulse, knowing that gossip, however distorted, often held fragments of truth, like pebbles glinting in a stream. St. Mary Mead was a picture of rural serenity, its thatched cottages and tidy gardens belying the keen eyes that watched from behind lace curtains. The post office, a squat brick building with a red-tiled roof, was the village's nerve centre, where news flowed as freely as the tea poured at the vicarage. Miss Marple pushed open the door, the bell above jingling cheerfully, and stepped into a warm, cluttered space smelling of ink and sealing wax. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, stood behind the counter, her round face framed by a halo of grey curls. Her spectacles perched on her nose as she sorted letters with the efficiency of a woman who missed nothing. A few villagers lingered, their voices low, their glances darting toward Miss Marple, with the curiosity reserved for outsiders who carried the scent of scandal. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and unassuming as she approached the counter, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "I thought I'd post a letter to my nephew, Raymond, and perhaps collect any news. St. Mary Mead is always so lively." Her smile was disarming, her tone that of a gossipy aunt, but her mild blue eyes, sharp beneath their deceptive softness, scanned the room, noting the sudden hush among the villagers. Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed, her hands pausing over a stack of envelopes. "Miss Marple, a pleasure as always," she said, her voice rich with the satisfaction of one who held the village's secrets. "We've all heard about the trouble up at Hillcrest. Dreadful business, Lord Conway murdered in his own study. The constable's been in a state, and now Scotland Yard's coming, they say." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're staying with Lady Beatrice, aren't you? What's the talk up there?" Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft clicking a soothing rhythm as she settled onto a stool by the counter. "Oh, it's a sad time, Mrs. Price," she said, her tone heavy with sympathy. "The household is in shock naturally, but I'm sure you've heard more than I have. Villages always know the undercurrents, don't they?" Her words were an invitation, and Mrs. Price, ever eager to share, took the bait with relish. "Undercurrents, indeed," Mrs. Price said, pushing her spectacles up her nose. "Hillcrest's been a nest of trouble for months, if you ask me. That German maid, for one, Elsa Schmidt calls herself, came out of nowhere, and with the war on, folks don't trust her. I had a letter come through, 3 weeks back, addressed to a London postbox, all in code, or so it looked. Constable Hodges took it, but nothing came of it." Her voice dropped lower, her eyes darting to the villagers behind her. "They say she takes walks at night, down by the old mill. What's a maid doing out so late, I ask you?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind cataloguing the detail. A coded letter, late-night walks, rumours, perhaps, but they echoed Beatrice's distrust of Elsa and the lavender scent in the study. "How curious," she said, her tone light. though I suppose the war makes us see spies everywhere. Fräulein Schmidt seems a quiet sort, from what I've seen." Her words were a gentle prod, testing the depth of the village's suspicions. "Quiet, maybe," Mrs. Price said, sniffing, "but too quiet, if you take my meaning. Mrs. Dane, the baker's wife, saw her lingering near the churchyard last month, looking at the gravestones. Said she had a notebook, scribbling something. Spies do that, don't they? Writing down names, places." She shook her head, her curls bouncing. Lord Conway didn't trust her either. Mr. Phipps, the grocer, heard him say so at the Red Lion not 2 weeks ago. Called her meddlesome and worse. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Harold's mistrust of Elsa, confirmed by village talk, aligned with the half-written letter in his study, its hint of suspicion cut short by death. She thought of Elsa's wary eyes, her quick denial of curiosity, and the lavender sachet in her apron. "Poor girl," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "It must be hard, being a stranger in such times. But what of the others at Hillcrest? Young Mr. Conway, for instance. Charles, isn't it?" She shifted the conversation, her needles pausing as she reached for a biscuit from the tin Mrs. Price offered. Mrs. Price's eyes narrowed, her voice taking on a gleeful edge. "Charles Conway? Oh, he's a piece of work. Always was, even as a lad. Charming when he wants to be. But trouble follows him like a shadow. He's been in and out of the Red Lion, drinking more than's good for him, and owing money left and right. Mr. Stokes, the bookmaker, says Charles is in deep. Thousands, they reckon, on horses and cards. Lord Conway wouldn't pay his debts, you know. Mrs. Stokes heard them arguing in the village square last month, Charles shouting that his uncle was strangling him. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving Charles's debts into the pattern of his volatile temper and shaky alibi. The note in his sketchbook, "Meet me at the Lion, 10 p.m., now took on a darker hue. Perhaps a meeting with a creditor, or worse. A young man with troubles, she mused, her tone sympathetic. It's sad when family ties strain so. But Lady Beatrice must keep things steady, I imagine. She's always been so capable." Mrs. Price snorted, her hands busy with the letters again. Capable, yes, but not a saint. Lady Beatrice runs Hillcrest like a queen, but she and Lord Conway didn't always see eye to eye. Mrs. Phipps, who cleans for the vicar, says they quarrelled over the estate's future. Beatrice wanted to modernise, bring in new tenants, but Lord Conway wouldn't hear of it, said it was selling the Conway soul, and with him planning to change his will, leaving it all to some Canadian nobody. Well, that didn't sit right with her, I'll wager. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her thoughts turning to Beatrice's argument with Harold, her quiet ambition to preserve Hillcrest's legacy. The village's gossip, while embroidered, confirmed her role as the estate's steward, her authority threatened by Harold's plans. "Families do clash over such things," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "But Mr. Grayson, the butler, he's been a steady presence, hasn't he? 20 years, I hear." Mrs. Price's lips pursed, her eyes gleaming with fresh tidbits. "Steady, yes, but not without his own shadows. Grayson's a closed book, that one. Polite as you please, but there's talk he wasn't always a butler. Mrs. Dane's cousin, who worked in London years back, says Grayson was tied to a family that fell on hard times. Some scandal, debts or worse. He came to Hillcrest to start fresh, But Lord Conway was hard on him lately, docking his wages, calling him ungrateful. Mr. Phipps saw Grayson at the post office last week, sending a money order, big one too, for a butler's pay. Where's he getting that, I wonder? Miss Marple's heart stirred, though her expression remained serene. Grayson's ink-stained cuff, his argument with Harold, now took on new weight. A past scandal, a mysterious money order, details that suggested a man with secrets, perhaps desperate enough to act. She thought of the hidden staircase, Grayson's room nearby, and the wiped-clean letter-opener. How intriguing, she said, her tone light. Though I suppose even the most loyal have their private lives. It's a wonder the village keeps such a sharp eye. Mrs. Price chuckled, clearly pleased. We don't miss much, Miss Marple. Like I said, Hillcrest's been brewing trouble. That coded letter, Charles's debts, Lady Beatrice's quarrels, Grayson's past, none of it sits right. And with Lord Conway poking into things, reading those books on spies and codes, well, it's no wonder someone wanted him gone. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper. Mrs. Stokes swears she saw Elsa near the mill last week, meeting a man in a dark coat. Couldn't see his face, but he wasn't local. What's that about, eh? Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Harold's books on cryptography, mentioned by Grayson, now echoed in the village's talk, suggesting a man who had stumbled onto something dangerous. Elsa's nocturnal meeting, if true, deepened the shadow around her, aligning with the coded letter and the lavender scent. Goodness, Miss Marple said, her voice all surprise. It does sound mysterious. But gossip can grow like weeds, can't it? Still, I'll keep my ears open. She rose, tucking her needles away, and handed Mrs. Price a letter for Raymond, her smile as warm as ever. As she left the post office, the bell jingling behind her, Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, the village's chatter buzzing in her mind, the coded letter, Charles's debts, Beatrice's ambitions, Grayson's hidden past, Elsa's midnight rendezvous. They were fragments, like the stitches in her knitting, each holding the promise of a pattern. She thought of the study's blue thread, the half-written letter, the scent of lavender. The village's whispers, while tinged with exaggeration, had given her leads to follow, threads to weave. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that gossip was a mirror, reflecting truth through a warped lens. Whether Elsa was a spy, Charles a debtor, Beatrice a schemer, or Grayson a man with a buried shame, she would find out. The church bell tolled noon, its sound carrying across the fields. Miss Marple tightened her shawl, her thoughts turning to Hillcrest, where the household awaited, their secrets as tightly locked as the study door. She would return, question further, watch for the small things, the glance, the hesitation, the unguarded word that revealed the heart. For now she walked on, her knitting bag at her side, her mind as sharp as the needles within, ready to unravel the next layer of Hillcrest's dark design. Chapter 8. The Hidden Clue. The pale light of a late autumn morning filtered through Hillcrest's tall windows, casting a muted glow across the manor's sombre halls. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, and her sensible hat tucked under her arm, moved with quiet purpose through the house, her footsteps soft against the polished oak floorboards. The past days had been a meticulous unravelling of Hillcrest's secrets. Beatrice's poised control, Charles's reckless anger, Grayson's guarded restraint, Elsa's wary silences, and the village's whispered suspicions. Each encounter had added threads to the tapestry of Lord Harold Conway's murder, but the pattern remained elusive, its heart hidden in the small overlooked details Miss Marple knew were the key. Her mild blue eyes, sharp beneath their deceptive gentleness, scanned the corridor as she approached the study once more, driven by an instinct that the room, the scene of the crime, held a clue yet undiscovered. The study door stood ajar, its heavy oak frame a silent sentinel to the tragedy within. Constable Hodges had been replaced by a Scotland Yard sergeant, a burly man named Wilkins, who nodded curtly as Miss Marple requested a moment alone in the room. "Mind you don't touch anything, ma'am," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, and assured him she would be careful. As Wilkins retreated to the hall, she stepped inside, the air heavy with the lingering scent of old books, brandy, and the faint metallic tang of blood, now faded but not forgotten. The room was as she had last seen it, the blood-stained Persian rug, the mahogany desk cluttered with papers, the silver letter opener gleaming on its surface, wiped clean of its deadly work. Yet something tugged at her, a sense that the room's secrets were not yet exhausted. Miss Marple closed the door softly, her eyes sweeping the study with the precision of a seamstress inspecting a hem. The sunlight slanted through the velvet, curtains illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air, and she moved to the desk, her gloved fingers hovering above the half-written letter to Harold's solicitor. The words, "My will must be altered. Charles cannot be trusted, and I suspect," remained as she had found them, their abrupt end a silent scream of interruption. She thought of Charles's debts, Beatrice's argument over the will, and Elsa's lavender scent, each a thread tied to this unfinished missive. But the letter, though revealing, was not the clue she sought today. Her instinct, honed by years in St. Mary Mead, told her to look lower, smaller, to the places others overlooked. She knelt by the desk, her knees protesting, but her resolve firm, and examined the rug's intricate weave, its crimson and gold threads marred by the dark stain of Harold's blood. Her fingers brushed the edge, and there, caught in the fringe, was the blue silk thread she had found before, its hue alien to the rug's palette. She left it in place, knowing Scotland Yard would need it undisturbed. But her mind noted its significance, a trace of someone's presence, perhaps Elsa's grey dress, or Grayson's suit, though neither seemed quite right. As she leaned closer, her eyes caught a glint beneath the desk, half hidden by the rug's shadow. She reached carefully, her handkerchief in hand, and retrieved a torn scrap of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, its edges ragged as if ripped in haste. Miss Marple rose, her heart quickening, and held the scrap to the light. The ink was faint but legible, the script precise and unmistakably German. Die Mission muss geschützt werden. Her schoolgirl German, rusty but serviceable, translated it. The mission must be protected. The words sent a shiver through her, their weight far greater than the paper's size. She thought of the village's whispers about Elsa's coded letter, Harold's books on cryptography, and the lavender scent that tied the maid to this room. The ink, she noted, matched the faint stain on Grayson's cuff, a detail that muddied it. The waters! Had he written it, or merely handled it? The handwriting, feminine and delicate, pointed more to Elsa, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that clues, like gossip, required careful sifting. She slipped the scrap into her handkerchief, tucking it into her knitting bag with the care of a jeweller handling a gem. The study's silence pressed in, and she moved to the bookshelves, her eyes scanning the titles. Military histories, treatises on codes, a worn volume on espionage nestled among the ledgers. Harold, she realized, had been more than a temperamental lord. He had been a man chasing a suspicion, perhaps one that cost him his life. She recalled Beatrice's mention of his obsession with wartime intrigue, Grayson's confirmation of his reading habits, and Mrs. Price's tale of a coded letter. The German note, small as it was a pivot, shifting the case from family greed to something darker, more perilous. Miss Marple turned to the hidden staircase behind the bookcase, its narrow steps spiralling to the upper floors. She had noted its dust before, disturbed but not heavily, suggesting a single, careful passage. Elsa's room was near its landing, as was Grayson's, and Charles's not far beyond. The staircase was a silent accomplice, offering access to the study without the corridor's exposure. She stepped closer, her eyes catching a faint smudge on the banister. Ink, perhaps, or polish. Too faint to be sure. She made a mental note to ask Wilkins to examine it, knowing Scotland Yard's tools could reveal what her eyes could not. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft creak from the corridor, and she turned, her composure unshaken, to see Beatrice, standing in the doorway, her black mourning dress stark against the hall's pale walls. "Jane, I didn't expect to find you here," Beatrice said, her voice steady but with a trace of unease. "Have you found something?" Her eyes, sharp despite her grief, darted to the desk, then to Miss Marple's knitting bag, as if sensing a discovery. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Only looking, my dear," she said, her tone light. "The study is such a telling room, isn't it? So much of Harold's mind is here." She moved toward Beatrice, her needles clicking softly as she tucked them away. "I was thinking of his papers, his interest in codes you mentioned. Did he ever share what he was pursuing?" The question was gentle, but her eyes were alert, watching for the flicker of knowledge in Beatrice's face. Beatrice's lips tightened, her hands clasping at her waist. "He was always reading, Jane," she said, her voice low. "Books on ciphers, espionage. He said it was a hobby, but it consumed him. He'd lock his papers in the desk, even from me. I thought it was just his way of coping with the war. But now—" She trailed off, her eyes drifting to the rug stain, and Miss Marple noted the genuine worry in her expression, tinged with something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "Now, you wonder if it led to his death," Miss Marple finished softly, her voice warm with sympathy. "It's natural, Beatrice, to question. I'd like to see Fräulein Schmidt's references, if I may. Her work is so efficient, but it's wise to be thorough, don't you think?" The request was casual, but her mind was fixed on Elsa. The German note, and the village's talk of forged papers. Beatrice nodded, her face pale, and promised to fetch them from the household records. As Beatrice left, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the desk. The German note was a revelation, but not the whole truth. She thought of Charles's note from the Red Lion, Grayson's ink-stained cuff, Elsa's lavender sachet. The study, with its single door and hidden staircase, was a stage, and the clue she had found was a prop, pointing to a larger drama. Had Harold uncovered a spy in his house? Or had his suspicions been a pretext for another's greed? In St. Mary Mead, she had seen small clues, a misplaced letter, a torn photograph, unravel lives. This note, with its cryptic command, was such a clue, and she would follow it, stitch by stitch. She left the study, closing the door behind her, and walked toward the drawing room, where Beatrice would bring the references. The corridor was silent, save for the distant chime of the grandfather clock, its rhythm a reminder of time's relentless march. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the household. Beatrice's ambition, Charles's desperation, Grayson's secrets, Elsa's past. The German note tied them all to the war's shadow. But whose hand had wielded the letter opener? She tightened, her shawl, her knitting bag, a familiar weight, and moved on, her mind as sharp as the needles within, ready to weave the next thread in Hillcrest's dark tapestry. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The early afternoon light filtered through Hillcrest's tall windows, casting a muted glow across the manor's sombre drawing-room, where the air seemed to hold its breath, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed armchair, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking softly in a rhythm that belied the sharpness of her mind. The past days had been a meticulous unravelling of the threads surrounding Lord Harold Conway's murder. Beatrice's poised control, Charles's reckless defiance, Grayson's guarded precision, Elsa's wary silences, the villagers' whispered suspicions, and the chilling German note found beneath the study's desk. Each discovery had tightened the web, and now, with Scotland Yard's arrival, the moment for confrontation had come. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes, deceptively gentle, scanned the room, noting the tension in the four figures before her, each a suspect in a drama that had turned Hillcrest into a house of shadows. Inspector Crane, a brusque man with a bulldog's jaw and a sceptical glint in his eye, stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his presence a stark contrast to the room's faded elegance. He had arrived from Scotland Yard that morning, his impatience with village theories evident in his clipped tone, but Miss Marple's discovery of the German note, Die Mission muss geschützt werden, had forced his attention. Beatrice sat on a velvet settee, her black morning dress immaculate, her hands clasped tightly, her face a mask of composed grief. Charles slouched in a corner chair, his paint-stained jacket rumpled, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his green eyes flickering with defiance. Grayson stood near the door, his butler's posture rigid, his dark eyes unreadable, though Miss Marple noted the faint ink stain on his cuff, a silent echo of the note's ink. Elsa hovered by the tea-tray, her pale blonde hair pinned severely, her ice-blue eyes darting nervously, the lavender sachet in her apron pocket a subtle clue that Miss Marple had not forgotten. Inspector Crane cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the room's silence. Miss Marple has brought us a piece of evidence, he said, holding up the torn scrap of paper, its German script stark against the light. Found in the study, under the desk. It translates to, "The mission must be protected. Serious, Business in wartime. I'll have questions for all of you, but we'll start with the maid, Fräulein Schmidt." His eyes fixed on Elsa, hard and unyielding, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in the girl's hands, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. Elsa stepped forward, her movements stiff, her voice low but steady. "I know nothing of this note, sir," she said, her German accent soft but distinct. "I am only a maid here to work. I did not write it, and I was not in the study that night." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple caught the quick glance toward Grayson, a fleeting spark of fear or plea that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She thought of Elsa's room near the hidden staircase, the lavender scent in the study, and the village's talk of a coded letter, each a thread tying her to the crime. Crane's eyes narrowed, his notebook snapping shut. "You'll forgive me if I don't take your word for it," he said, his tone dry. "Miss Marple says your references are being checked, and I've got a mind to dig deeper. A German maid, in a house where the master's been murdered, with a note like this. It doesn't look good, Fräulein." He stepped closer, his bulk looming, and Elsa's face paled, her fingers clutching the sachet as if it were a lifeline. Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice gentle but clear. "Inspector, if I may," she said, her tone disarming, as if she were merely clarifying a point at a tea party. "The note is troubling, yes, but it's the context that matters. Lord Conway was reading about codes, espionage. His books are in the study. He suspected something, perhaps someone in this house. The note suggests he was right." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on each suspect, her words a quiet challenge to their secrets. Charles snorted, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Oh, come, off it," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "You're saying Uncle Harold was playing spy-catcher? He was a miser, not a hero. If anyone had a reason to kill him, it wasn't some secret mission. It was his blasted will, cutting me out." His eyes darted to Beatrice, a flash of resentment crossing his face, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand trembled, the cigarette ash falling to the rug. His outburst, she thought, was both a defence and a distraction. His debts and the note. From the red lion still vivid in her mind, Beatrice's hands tightened in her lap, her sapphire ring catching the light. "Charles, please," she said, her voice low but sharp. "This is no time for your temper. Jane, you can't seriously think Harold was involved in espionage?" Her tone was incredulous, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her eyes, the way her gaze shifted to Elsa, then away. Beatrice's argument with Harold over the will, her control over Hillcrest, made her a player in this drama, and Miss Marple wondered if her disbelief was genuine, or a carefully crafted mask. Grayson remained silent, his posture unchanged, but Miss Marple saw the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the way his eyes followed the note in Crane's hand. The ink stain on his cuff, matching the note's ink, was a puzzle she had yet to solve. Was he a bystander, a conspirator, or something else? His argument with Harold, the village's talk of a scandalous past, suggested a man with motives buried, deep. Crane turned back to Elsa, his voice hard. "Let's have it then," he said. "Where were you the night Lord Conway was killed? And don't give me that upstairs cleaning nonsense. That staircase near your room leads right to the study. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" He tapped the note against his palm, his eyes boring into her. and Miss Marple watched Elsa closely, noting the way her breath hitched, the sachet crumpling. In her grip, Elsa's voice trembled, but she held her ground. "I was in my room, sir, after my work. I swear it. I am no spy, no killer. I fled Berlin because of the war, because my brother—" She stopped, her eyes widening as if she'd said too much, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. A brother, a new detail, slipped out in her panic. She thought of the village's tale of Elsa meeting a man by the mill. Perhaps this brother, perhaps a contact. "Your brother?" Crane pounced, his voice sharp. "What's he got to do with it? Speak up, girl, or I'll have you in cuffs by nightfall." His threat hung in the air, and Elsa's composure cracked, her eyes filling with tears, though she fought to keep them back. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Fräulein Schmidt, it's best to tell the truth," she said, her tone that of a kind aunt, though her eyes were steady, probing. "Your brother, your past, they may help us understand. Lord Conway suspected you, didn't he? That note suggests he was close to something dangerous." Her words were gentle, but they carried a weight, urging Elsa to unburden herself before Crane's impatience turned to action. Elsa's shoulders sagged, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother Hans was a scientist," she said, her accent thickening with emotion. "He worked for the Reich, but he wanted out. He defected, came to England, and I followed to protect him. I took this job to hide, to be safe. Lord Conway, he asked questions, watched me. I was afraid he'd turn me in." Her eyes darted to the note, then to Grayson, and Miss Marple caught the glance, a silent plea or warning she couldn't yet decipher. Charles leapt to his feet, his cigarette falling to the floor. "That's rich," he snapped, his voice thick with scorn. "A sob story about a brother, and you expect us to believe it? I'll tell you what I think. She's a thief, too. Uncle Harold's watch, gold with a crest. It's gone. I'd bet my last shilling it's in her room, pinched to fund her mission." His accusation was venomous, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands shook, the scratch on his wrist still visible, a reminder of his own secrets. Beatrice gasped, her hand rising to her throat. "Charles, that's enough," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't know that. Jane, Inspector, surely we must verify her story before jumping to such conclusions." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, a mix of fear and hope, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the watch, a new clue that might shift the pattern. Grayson spoke for the first time, his voice low and measured. "If I may, sir," he said, addressing Crane, "the watch was indeed missing when we cleared the study, but I saw no sign of it in Fräulein Schmidt's room when I checked the staff quarters for Constable Hodges." His words were calm, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance he gave Elsa, a spark of something, loyalty, perhaps, or collusion, that deepened the mystery of his role. Crane's eyes narrowed, his notebook opening again. "We'll search her room, then," he said, his tone final. "And yours, Mr. Grayson, for good measure. Miss Marple, you've stirred up a hornet's nest with this note. Anything else you've been keeping quiet about?" His question was sharp, but Miss Marple smiled, her composure unshaken. "Only that the truth is like a skein of wool, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle. "Tangled at first, but with patience it straightens out. I trust you'll find what's needed." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on Elsa's tear-streaked face, Charles's clenched fists, Beatrice's rigid posture, Grayson's unreadable calm, the note, the watch, the brother's defection. They were pieces of a puzzle, each shifting the pattern closer to clarity. As Crane barked orders to Wilkins for the search, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The confrontation had cracked the household's facade, revealing fears and accusations. But the heart of the crime, the hand that wielded the letter opener, remained hidden. She thought of the study's blue thread, the hidden staircase, the village's talk of a man by the mill. Elsa's story, if true, painted her as a fugitive, not a spy, but her proximity to the study, her lavender scent, made her a figure of suspicion. Charles's accusation, Grayson's defence, Beatrice's unease, each was a thread, and Miss Marple would follow them, stitch by stitch, until the truth lay bare. The room emptied, Crane leading Elsa to her quarters, Beatrice following with a murmur of protest, Charles stalking out with a curse. Grayson lingered, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a moment, a silent acknowledgment of her scrutiny. She smiled, her expression serene, and he left, his footsteps fading into the house's silence. Miss Marple tightened her shawl, her thoughts racing. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen confrontations like this, moments when masks slipped, revealing the raw edges of human nature. The German note, the missing watch, the brother's shadow, they were clues, small but sharp, and she would wield them with the precision of her needles, ready to unravel the final secrets of Hillcrest's dark design. Chapter 10. The Motive Unraveled. The late afternoon sun cast long golden rays through the tall windows of Hillcrest's drawing-room, bathing the faded chintz and ancestral portraits in a deceptive warmth that did little to ease the chill of suspicion that hung over the household. Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar high-backed armchair, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking with a steady rhythm that belied the intensity of her thoughts. The past days had been a meticulous weaving of clues, Beatrice's controlled ambition, Charles's volatile desperation, Grayson's guarded past, Elsa's cryptic silences, the village's whispered rumours, the German note beneath the study's desk, and the tense confrontation that had cracked the household's facade. Now, with Scotland Yard's Inspector Crane pacing the room, his bulldog jaw set and his notebook brimming with questions, Miss Marple sensed the moment had come to draw the threads together, to reveal the pattern that pointed to the killer. Her mild blue eyes, sharp beneath their deceptive gentleness, swept over the four suspects gathered before her, each a figure in a drama that had turned Hillcrest into a stage for murder. Beatrice sat on the velvet settee, her black mourning dress stark against the pale cushions, her hands clasped so tightly that her sapphire ring bit into her skin. Her face was a mask of composed grief, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her lips, the way her eyes darted to the others as if measuring their guilt against her own. Charles lounged in a corner chair, his paint-stained jacket rumpled, a fresh cigarette smouldering between his fingers. His green eyes narrowed with a mix of defiance and unease. Grayson stood by the door, his butler's posture impeccable, his dark eyes unreadable, though the ink stain on his cuff, a silent echo of the German note, remained a puzzle in Miss Marple's mind. Elsa stood near the tea-tray, her pale blonde, hair pinned severely, her ice-blue eyes wide with fear, the lavender sachet in her apron pocket a subtle reminder of her presence in the study. Inspector Crane, his patience worn thin by the household's evasions, stopped pacing and faced them, his voice a low growl. "We've danced around this long enough," Crane said, his notebook snapping shut with a sound like a gavel. Lord, Conway was stabbed in his study, the letter opener wiped clean, a German note hidden under his desk. Someone in this room knows more than they're saying, and I'm done with half-truths. Miss Marple, you've been poking about. Let's hear what you've pieced together. His tone was grudging, his scepticism of her village theories still evident, but the weight of the German note had forced his respect, if not his trust. Miss Marple's needles paused, her hands resting lightly on her knitting, her smile serene but her voice clear and steady. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, her tone that of a schoolmistress addressing a class, gentle but commanding attention. "Murder, as I've often found, is like a tangled skein of wool. It seems chaotic, but with patience the knots unravel, revealing a pattern. Lord Conway's death is no exception. The clues, the letter opener, the hidden staircase, the blue thread, the lavender scent, the German note point to a motive rooted not only in family strife, but in something deeper, something tied to the war's shadows." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on each suspect, her words a quiet challenge to their secrets. Beatrice's hands tightened, her voice low but firm. "Jane, you can't mean to suggest this is about espionage. Harold was difficult, yes, but he was no spy hunter. His will, his quarrels with Charles, that's where the truth lies, surely." Her eyes flicked to her nephew, a mix of reproach and fear, and Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in her posture, as if bracing for a blow. Beatrice's argument with Harold, her control over Hillcrest's future, made her a figure of suspicion, but her denial of espionage felt genuine, a reflection of her focus on family, not war. Charles snorted, exhaling a plume of smoke, his voice thick with scorn. "Aunt Beatrice has it right for once," he said, his tone biting. "Uncle Harold was a miser, not some hero chasing spies. He was going to cut me out, leave everything to a stranger. That's motive enough for anyone in this room, except maybe the butler." His eyes darted to Grayson, then to Elsa, his accusation broad but pointed, and Miss Marple caught the tremor in his hand, the scratch on his wrist still visible, a reminder of his own volatile night at the Red Lion. Grayson remained silent, his posture unchanged, but Miss Marple saw the slight clench of his jaw, the way his eyes followed Charles's gesture. His defence of Elsa during the confrontation, his ink-stained cuff, and the village's talk of a scandalous past suggested a man with secrets. But his role in the murder remained unclear. Was he a bystander, a protector, or something more? Elsa's hands trembled, the lavender sachet crumpling in her grip, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am no spy," she said, her accent thickening with emotion. "I told you, I fled to protect my brother. Lord Conway suspected me, yes, but I did not kill him." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, a plea for belief, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, though her mind remained sharp, weighing Elsa's story against the lavender scent, the hidden staircase, and the German note. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Let us consider the facts," she said, her eyes moving from one suspect to another. Lord Conway was found in his study, stabbed with a letter opener, the weapon wiped clean. A deliberate act, not a moment of passion. The room had one door and a hidden staircase, accessible to all in this house. A blue thread, not from the rug, suggests someone's presence. A lavender scent, faint but distinct, lingers in the air. And then there's the note. The mission must be protected, in German, hidden beneath the desk, its ink matching a stain on Mr. Grayson's cuff, its handwriting feminine, precise. She paused, letting her words settle, noting the way Elsa's breath hitched. Grayson's eyes narrowed. Charles's cigarette paused mid-air. Beatrice's hands froze. She continued, her tone measured. Lord Conway was not merely a man of temper, as we've heard. His books on codes, his half-written letter to his solicitor, I suspect, show a man who believed he'd uncovered a threat. The village speaks of a coded letter sent by Fräulein Schmidt, of late-night meetings by the mill. His suspicions, I believe, centred on her. Her eyes rested on Elsa, not accusing but probing, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Elsa's face paled, her voice rising in desperation. "I wrote no such note," she cried, her hands clutching the sachet. "I was in my room, I swear it. I fled Germany to escape, not to betray. My brother—" She stopped, tears welling, and Miss Marple noted the raw fear in her eyes, the way her gaze flicked to Grayson, as if seeking an ally. Crane stepped forward, his voice hard. "Enough of that," he said, his notebook opening again. "You admitted your brother's a defector, and now we've got a German note in the murder room. You expect us to believe you're just a maid. Where's this brother now? And what's this mission about?" His questions were a barrage, and Elsa shrank back, her composure crumbling. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but commanding. "Inspector, let us not rush," she said, her smile disarming. "Fräulein Schmidt's story is part of the pattern, but not the whole. Consider the letter opener, wiped clean, suggesting calculation. The lavender scent, which I've noticed on Fräulein Schmidt's sachet, places her near the study, but scents linger, and others could use lavender. The note's ink matches Mr. Grayson's cuff, yet its handwriting is not his. And Mr. Conway's watch, missing since the murder, has not been found, despite searches." Her eyes moved to Charles, whose accusation about the watch had rung hollow, then to Grayson, whose defence of Elsa was a thread yet to be pulled. She turned to Beatrice, her voice gentle. "Lady Beatrice, you told me Harold argued with you the night before his death, about his will. You pleaded for Charles, but he was resolute. That will, naming a distant cousin, threatened your control over Hillcrest, did it not?" Beatrice's eyes widened, her hands unclenching, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear, quickly masked by indignation. "Jane, you can't think I—" Beatrice began, her voice trembling. "I loved Harold, despite our differences. I would never harm him." Her words were sincere, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided Charles, as if his presence were a reminder of her failed mediation. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Charles. "Mr. Conway, your debts, your anger at your uncle's decision, place you under suspicion. Your alibi at the Red Lion is vague, and the scratch on your wrist suggests a struggle. Yet your accusation of Fräulein Schmidt feels convenient, as if deflecting attention. Charles's cigarette fell to the rug, his face flushing, but he said nothing, his silence louder than words. To Grayson she said, "Mr. Grayson, your loyalty to Hillcrest is clear, but your argument with Lord Conway, your ink-stained cuff, and the village's talk of a hidden past raise questions. Did you know of his suspicions? Perhaps protect someone?" Grayson's eyes met hers, steady but unyielding, and he remained silent, his restraint a wall Miss Marple could not yet breach. Finally, she turned to Elsa, her voice soft but unrelenting. "Fräulein Schmidt, your brother's defection, your forged references, the lavender scent, the note, they point to a secret you've guarded fiercely. Lord Conway confronted you, didn't he? Threatened to expose you, to ruin your safety. That note suggests a mission, perhaps not yours alone, but one you felt compelled to protect." Her words were a quiet accusation, and Elsa's tears spilled over, her hands shaking as she clutched the sachet. The room was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire and the distant chime of the grandfather clock. Crane's eyes widened, his scepticism giving way to grudging admiration, but he held back, letting Miss Marple's words work their effect. Beatrice's face was pale, Charles's fists clenched, Grayson's posture rigid, Elsa's sobs soft, but wrenching. Miss Marple leaned back, her needles resuming their rhythm, her voice calm. "The motive, I believe, lies in fear. Fear of exposure, of losing safety, of a secret that could destroy. Lord Conway's letter to his solicitor named Fräulein Schmidt as a threat, but it was unfinished, interrupted by his killer. The lavender, scent, the staircase's proximity, the note's words, they point to a calculated act, not a family quarrel." Her eyes rested on Elsa, steady and unyielding, and she said, "You killed to protect your secret, didn't you?" Elsa's sobs stopped, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's, and for a moment the room seemed to freeze, the truth teetering on the edge of revelation. The lavender sachet, the German note, the hidden staircase, they were threads, and Miss Marple had woven them into a pattern that named the killer, though the final confession remained unspoken. In St. Mary Mead she had seen such moments, when silence broke, revealing the heart of a crime. She waited, her knitting needles still, her mind as sharp as the letter opener that had ended Harold's life, ready for the truth to unravel. Chapter 11. The Confession. The drawing-room at Hillcrest was steeped in a heavy silence, the late afternoon light filtering through the tall windows and casting long, wavering shadows across the faded chintz and polished mahogany. The air seemed to pulse with the weight of truths half-spoken, the tension as taut as a tightly pulled thread in one of Miss Jane Marple's knitting projects. She sat in her high-backed armchair, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her hands still, the knitting needles resting in her lap like a judge's gavel awaiting its moment. Her mild blue eyes, sharp beneath their deceptive gentleness, held Fräulein Elsa Schmidt in a steady gaze, the German maid standing near the tea-tray, her pale face drained of colour, her ice-blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. The words Miss Marple had just spoken, "You killed to protect your secret, didn't you?" hung in the room like a storm cloud, their quiet force drawing every eye to Elsa, whose trembling hands clutched the lavender sachet in her apron pocket as if it were her last anchor to composure. Inspector Crane stood by the fireplace. Hitiotafu, bulldog jaw clenched, his notebook poised but forgotten as he watched the scene unfold, his earlier scepticism of Miss Marple's methods giving way to a grudging respect. Lady Beatrice Conway sat rigid on the velvet settee, her black mourning dress stark against the pale cushions, her sapphire ring glinting as her hands twisted in her lap, her eyes flickering between Elsa and Miss Marple, with a mix of dread and disbelief. Charles Conway slouched in his corner chair, his cigarette extinguished, his green eyes narrowed, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if he sensed the noose tightening around another's neck. Mr. Grayson, the butler, stood by the door, his posture as impeccable as ever, his dark eyes unreadable, though Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in his stance, a tightening of the shoulders that betrayed an inner turmoil. The German note, Die Mission muss geschützt werden, lay on the table before Crane, its cryptic words a silent witness to the drama unfolding. Elsa's breath hitched, her voice barely audible, a whisper that seemed to come from a place of deep exhaustion. I did not want to kill," she said, her German accent thickening, her words stumbling over each other like stones in a rushing stream. "You must understand, I had no choice." Her eyes, brimming with tears, met Miss Marple's, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath, the confession teetering on the edge of revelation. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her gaze steady, inviting Elsa to unburden herself, to let the tangled skein of her secret unravel at last. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his voice sharp but controlled. "No choice, you say? You'd better explain yourself, Fraulein, and quickly. Lord Conway was stabbed in his own study, and that note points straight to you. Start talking, or I'll have you in a cell by nightfall." His threat was a low growl, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture gentle but firm, silencing him as she leaned forward, her voice soft like a friend offering solace. "Fräulein Schmidt," she said, her tone warm but insistent, "the truth is a heavy burden, but it's lighter when shared. Tell us what happened that night. Your brother, your mission, help us understand why Lord Conway had to die." Her words were a lifeline, and Elsa's tears spilled over, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her secret had finally broken her resolve. Elsa sank onto a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the lavender sachet, its faint scent mingling with the room's stale air. "My brother Hans," she began, her voice quavering. "He was a scientist in Berlin, working on things I did not understand, machines, codes. He hated the Reich, what it made him do. 2 years ago, he defected, came to England, and I followed to keep him safe. We were given new names, new lives, but we had to be careful. I took this job at Hillcrest, thinking a quiet village would be a place to hide." Her eyes dropped to the sachet, her fingers tracing its edges, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, a reminder of the lavender that had betrayed her presence in the study. She continued, her voice steadier now, as if the act of speaking gave her strength. "Lord Conway was kind at first, but he began to watch me, to ask questions, where I was from, why I had no family. He had books, papers, about codes, spies. He found my references, saw they were false, Last week he called me to his study, said he knew I was hiding something, that he'd tell the authorities unless I confessed. I was terrified, not for me, but for Hans. If they found me, they'd find him, and he'd be sent back or worse. Her voice broke, and she pressed the sachet to her lips, her tears soaking the fabric. Miss Marple's heart stirred with pity, but her mind remained clear, piecing together the threads, the hidden staircase near Elsa's room, the lavender scent, the German note. "So you acted," she said gently, her voice a prompt, not an accusation. "To protect your brother, you went to the study that night." Elsa nodded, her sobs quiet but wrenching. "It was late, after the house was still. I used the back staircase. I knew it from cleaning the upper halls. I only meant to talk, to beg him to stay silent. But he was angry, shouting that I was a spy, a danger. He reached for his desk, for a letter, said he'd send it to London. I panicked. The letter opener was there on the desk, and I grabbed it. I didn't think, I just struck." Her voice faltered, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if seeing the blood-stained rug again. "He fell, and I wiped the opener, hid the note I'd written to Hans, warning him. I didn't mean to kill, but I couldn't let him destroy us." The room was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire and the distant chime of the grandfather clock. Beatrice's hand rose, to her throat, her face pale, her voice a whisper. "Elsa, how could you?" Her words carried shock, but Miss Marple noted the relief in her eyes, the subtle relaxation of her shoulders, as if the confession had lifted a weight from her own conscience. Charles's smirk faded, his cigarette forgotten, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and vindication, though Miss Marple saw the flicker of guilt in his gaze, perhaps for his own accusations. Grayson's face remained unreadable, but his hands, clasped behind his back, tightened. The ink stain on his cuff, a silent question Miss Marple had yet to answer. Crane's notebook snapped open, his voice brisk. "That's a confession, then," he said, his tone triumphant. "You admit to stabbing Lord Conway, wiping the weapon, hiding the note. Anything else you want to add before I take you in?" He moved toward Elsa, his hand reaching for his cuffs, but Miss Marple's voice, calm and clear, stopped him. "Inspector, a moment," she said, her smile disarming. "Fräulein Schmidt's confession explains much, but not all. The lavender sachet, a gift from her brother, as she said, betrayed her presence. The hidden staircase gave her access. The note, the mission must be protected, was her warning to Hans, not a spy's directive. But there are threads left untied." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on Grayson's cuff, Charles's scratched wrist, Beatrice's clasped hands. The blue thread in the rug, the missing watch, Mr. Grayson's ink stain. They suggest others may have been near the study, or known more than they've said. Crane's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, stepping back, his respect for Miss Marple now unmistakable. "Go on, then," he said, his voice gruff. "What's your point?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice measured, her knitting needles still. The murder was not a conspiracy, but it was shaped by the household's secrets. "Lady Beatrice, your argument with Lord Conway over his will placed you in the study that night, though I believe you left him alive. Your fear for Hillcrest's future was real, but not deadly. Beatrice's eyes widened, her lips parting, but she said nothing, her silence a confirmation of Miss Marple's insight. To Charles she said, "Mr. Conway, your debts and anger made you a suspect, but your alibi, however vague, holds. The scratch on your wrist, the note from the Red Lion, they point to a quarrel, perhaps with a creditor, not murder. Your accusation of Fräulein Schmidt was a deflection, born of fear." Charles's face flushed, his eyes dropping, and Miss Marple saw the shame in his posture, the weight of his recklessness. To Grayson she turned, her voice gentle but probing. "Mr. Grayson, your ink-stained cuff matches the note's ink, but your handwriting does not. You found the note, didn't you? Perhaps after the murder, when you checked the study. You kept silent to protect Fräulein Schmidt, or perhaps the household's honour." Grayson's eyes met hers, a flicker of acknowledgment passing through them, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by another. Finally, she returned to Elsa, her voice soft but unrelenting. "Fräulein Schmidt, your confession is the heart of this tragedy. You acted in fear to protect your brother, but the lavender sachet, a gift from him, betrayed you. The note, meant for Hans, was your undoing. Lord Conway's suspicions, fueled by his books and the war's paranoia, pushed you to a desperate act." Her words were a verdict, delivered with the compassion of one who understood human frailty, and Elsa's sobs resumed, her head bowing under the weight of her guilt. Crane moved forward, his cuffs in hand, his voice softer now. "Fräulein Schmidt, you're under arrest for the murder of Lord Harold Conway," he said, his tone formal but not unkind. He guided her gently from the room, her steps faltering, her lavender sachet falling to the floor, a small, poignant relic of her crime. Wilkins, the sergeant, followed, leaving the drawing-room in a hush, the fire's crackle the only sound. Beatrice rose, her face ashen, her voice trembling. "Jane, how did you know?" she asked, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face for answers. "So many secrets, and yet you saw through them all." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. "People are not so different, my dear," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, I've seen fear, love, desperation. They weave the same patterns, whether in a cottage or a manor. The small things, the sachet, the thread, the note, tell the story if you listen." Her eyes drifted to the window, where the sun was sinking, casting Hillcrest in twilight's embrace. Charles stood, his hands in his pockets, his voice low. I suppose I owe you an apology," he muttered, his eyes avoiding hers. "I was a fool pointing fingers. I'll try to do better." His words were grudging, but Miss Marple saw the spark of resolve in his gaze, a faint hope for redemption. Grayson stepped forward, his voice quiet but clear. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I found the note after the murder. I thought to protect her, to spare the house more shame. I was wrong." His admission was a weight lifted, and Miss Marple nodded, her heart stirred by his loyalty, however misplaced. As the room emptied, Miss Marple remained, her knitting needles clicking softly, her thoughts turning to the study, the blood-stained rug, the hidden staircase, the German note. Elsa's confession had unravelled the mystery, but it left a bittersweet ache. a reminder of the war's cruel reach, turning a frightened girl into a killer. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such tragedies. Lives undone by fear, by secrets too heavy to bear. She tightened her shawl, her mind already drifting to the train back home, where new stories, new patterns awaited her quiet scrutiny. Chapter 12. The Quiet Departure. The early evening light draped Hillcrest in a soft, mournful glow, the sun sinking behind the elms and casting long, wavering shadows across the manor's ivy-clad walls. The house, once a beacon of Georgian grandeur, now seemed to sag under the weight of its recent tragedy, its windows reflecting the fading day like eyes weary from too much sorrow. Miss Jane Marple stood at the threshold of the drawing-room, her black shawl folded neatly over her arm, her sensible hat in hand, her knitting bag of familiar weight at her side. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplace, mingling with the lingering echoes of Elsa Schmidt's confession. A confession that had unravelled the mystery of Lord Harold Conway's murder, revealing a young woman driven to desperation by fear for her brother's safety. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes, sharp beneath their deceptive gentleness, took in the room one last time, noting the subtle shifts in the household now that the truth had been laid bare. Lady Beatrice Conway stood by the fireplace, her black mourning, dress softened by a lace shawl, her silver hair catching the firelight as she turned to face Miss Marple. Her face, once a mask of composed grief, now bore the raw edges of relief and exhaustion, her sapphire ring glinting as her hands moved restlessly at her sides. Charles Conway lingered near the window, his paint-stained jacket replaced by a cleaner one, his dark hair combed for once, though his green eyes still held a flicker of unease. Mr. Grayson, the butler, stood by the door, his posture as impeccable as ever, his dark eyes steady, the ink stain on his cuff now faded but not forgotten. The absence of Fräulein Elsa Schmidt, now in Scotland Yard's custody, was a palpable void, her lavender sachet no longer scenting the air, her confession a wound that had both healed and scarred the household. Beatrice stepped forward, her voice low but warm, carrying a sincerity that Miss Marple had not heard in their earlier exchanges. "Jane, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her hands clasping briefly, as if to steady herself. "You've brought us peace, or as much as we can hope for, after such a loss. Harold's death, it was a shadow over us all, but you saw through it, found the truth where we saw only chaos." Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, met Miss Marple's, and for a moment the weight of Hillcrest's legacy seemed to lift, revealing the woman beneath the title. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene, her voice gentle but firm. "My dear Beatrice, I only did what was needed," she said, her knitting bag swinging slightly as she adjusted her shawl. "The truth, you know, is like a garden. It needs tending, a bit of pruning here and there, to reveal its shape. Hillcrest's secrets were tangled, but they were human secrets, no different from those I've seen in St. Mary Mead." Her words were a comfort, but her mind was already cataloguing the threads she had woven. The German note, the hidden staircase, the lavender scent, the blue thread, each a stitch in the pattern that had named Elsa as the killer. Beatrice's lips trembled, and she reached out, touching Miss Marple's arm lightly. "You're too modest, Jane. You saw what Scotland Yard could not, what I could not. I blamed Charles, feared for Grayson, suspected Elsa, but I never imagined her brother, her fear. It's a tragedy, isn't it, that the war could drive a girl to such an act." Her voice softened, and Miss Marple noted the genuine sorrow in her eyes, a contrast to the ambition that had once clouded her motives. Beatrice's argument with Harold over the will, her fierce protection of Hillcrest's future, had been real, but not deadly, and now, with the estate secure under her stewardship, she seemed to find a fragile peace. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the ancestral portraits above the fireplace, their stern faces a reminder of the Conway legacy. "A tragedy, yes," she said, her tone tinged with sadness. "War twists us all, Beatrice, in ways we cannot foresee. Elsa acted to protect her brother, but her fear was her undoing. The lavender sachet, a gift from him, was her silent betrayer, as was the note she wrote to warn him. She thought of the study's blood-stained rug, the wiped-clean letter-opener, and felt a pang for the young woman whose desperation had led to such a final act." Charles stepped away from the window, his hands in his pockets, his voice gruff but earnest. "I owe you, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before dropping to the floor. "I was a fool, running my mouth, pointing at Elsa to save my own skin. I didn't kill Uncle Harold, but I wasn't exactly a saint, either. Those debts, the rows. I'm going to sort myself out, try to make something of myself. For Aunt Beatrice, if not for me." His words were halting, but Miss Marple saw the spark of resolve in his posture, a faint echo of the boy he might have been before recklessness took hold. The scratch on his wrist, the vague alibi at the Red Lion, had pointed to his turmoil, but not to murder, and now, chastened, he seemed ready to mend his ways. Miss Marple's smile warmed, her voice gentle. "That's a fine start, Mr. Conway," she said, her needles emerging from her bag, their soft clicking a soothing counterpoint to her words. "We all stumble, but it's the getting up that matters. Hillcrest needs you, and I suspect you'll find your place here in time." She thought of the note in his sketchbook, "Meet me at the Lion, 10 p.m., and wondered if his creditors would give him the chance to reform. But she kept her thoughts to herself, trusting his newfound resolve to carry him forward. Grayson moved from the door, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much, yet remained steadfast. "Miss Marple, your insight spared this house further pain," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers with a rare openness. "I was wrong to hide the note, to think silence would protect Fräulein Schmidt or Hillcrest. My loyalty was misplaced, but you saw the truth where I saw only duty." His admission was a quiet confession, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the ink stain on his cuff, as if he had scrubbed it away along with his guilt. His defence of Elsa, his buried past whispered of in the village, had been threads in the mystery, but his role was that of a guardian, not a killer. And now he stood unburdened, ready to serve Hillcrest once more. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression kind but discerning. "Loyalty is a noble thing, Mr. Grayson," she said, her needles clicking softly, "but it can blind us, as it did you. The note, the ink on your cuff, they were clues, but they led to Elsa, not to you. Hillcrest is fortunate to have your steadiness, and I trust you'll guide it well." Her words were a gentle absolution, and Grayson's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but a sign of gratitude that warmed the room's sombre air. Beatrice gestured to a tray of tea things, her voice regaining its hostess's grace. "Jane, won't you stay for tea? The train to St. Mary Mead isn't for another hour, and I'd feel better knowing you're fortified for the journey." Her offer was sincere, but Miss Marple sensed a need to delay the parting, to hold on to the woman who had brought clarity to Hillcrest's chaos. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle but firm. "You're very kind, Beatrice, but I must be off. My nephew, Raymond, expects me, and I've a garden at home that needs tending. Besides, Hillcrest has its own work to do now, healing, rebuilding. You'll manage splendidly, I'm sure." Her words were a quiet encouragement, and Beatrice's eyes softened, a tear escaping as she nodded, accepting the inevitable farewell. As Miss Marple moved toward the hall, Charles stepped forward, his voice awkward but genuine. "I'll walk you to the gate, Miss Marple, least I can do." His offer was unexpected, and Miss Marple accepted with a nod, her heart stirred by his effort to bridge the gap his earlier defiance had created. Grayson opened the door, his bow a silent tribute, and Beatrice followed, her hand lingering on Miss Marple's arm, as if reluctant to let go. The gravel path to the gate crunched underfoot, the evening air crisp with the promise of frost. Charles walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, his silence heavy with thoughts he struggled to voice. "You didn't have to believe in me," he said at last, his voice low. "I gave you every reason to think I did it. Why didn't you?" His question was raw, a young man grappling with his own flaws, and Miss Marple paused, her eyes lifting to the darkening sky. "Because, Mr. Conway," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "I've seen enough of human nature to know that anger is not always guilt, nor despair a confession. Your heart was troubled but not murderous. The clues, the thread, the sachet, the note, pointed elsewhere, and I followed them." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of her experience, and Charles nodded, his shoulders relaxing, as if her trust had lightened his burden. At the gate, he opened it for her, his voice softer now. "Safe travels, Miss Marple, and thank you." He turned back to the house, his figure retreating into the twilight, and Miss Marple watched him go, her heart hopeful for the man he might become. The village taxi awaited, its driver a familiar face from St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple settled into the seat, her knitting bag on her lap. As the car rumbled toward the station, she gazed at Hillcrest's silhouette, its chimneys stark against the sky. The case was solved, Elsa's confession a tragic resolution, but the echoes of the mystery lingered. The German note, the hidden staircase, the lavender scent, the blue thread. She thought of Harold's books on codes, his fatal suspicion, and Elsa's desperate act to protect her brother. In St. Mary Mead she had seen such stories, lives undone by fear, by secrets too heavy to bear, and Hillcrest was no different, its grandeur a mere backdrop to human frailty. At the station, the platform was quiet, the train's whistle a distant promise. Miss Marple boarded, finding a corner seat by the window, her knitting needles emerging as the train began to move. The countryside rolled past, its fields and hedgerows a soothing contrast to Hillcrest's shadows. She thought of Beatrice, now free to steer Hillcrest's future, of Charles, poised for redemption, of Grayson, his loyalty tempered by truth, and Elsa, poor Elsa, whose fear had led to a cell, her lavender sachet a poignant relic of her lost freedom. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind drifting to St. Mary Mead, where her cottage awaited, its garden needing her care. The village would buzz with news of Hillcrest's scandal, but she would listen quietly, her thoughts on the small things, the glance, the hesitation, the unguarded word that revealed the heart. New mysteries would come as they always did, and she would meet them with the same quiet resolve, her knitting a steady companion. For now she closed her eyes, the train's rhythm lulling her, the case of Hillcrest's 4 suspects a pattern, complete, its threads woven into the tapestry of her memory.